The trap in the dust, the planet was dry, cracked and red like old blood. Sandstorms moved across the plains sharp as knives. No one lived here, not anymore. The ruins of some alien outpost lay half buried in the dust. It was quiet. Too quiet. Dan stepped over a pile of scorched rocks. His boots crunched softly on the ground. His helmet visor flickered with static, but the radar was still working. He was scanning the area for energy signals. His mission was to find old tech, anything salvageable. It was supposed to be a quick job. Then he heard something. A low growl. But it wasn't hostile. It sounded like pain. He stopped walking and looked around. The growl came again, longer this time, filled with desperation. He followed it. Around the side of a collapsed wall, he saw her. A large figure was stuck between two sharp metal beams, her legs tangled in broken wiring. Her arms were strong, covered in short striped fur, and her face was a mix of beast and woman, feline eyes, sharp jaw, and wild black hair. She looked like a warrior, but right now she was bleeding, trapped, and barely moving. Dan's heart pounded. He had seen her kind in briefing files. They were called the Valari, a fierce warrior species. They didn't trust humans, and humans didn't trust them. But this one was dying. He stepped forward slowly, raising his empty hands. "I'm not here to fight," he said through the speaker. "I'm going to help you. Don't move." The beast woman didn't speak. She just stared at him with burning golden eyes. Then she gave a slow nod. Dan carefully knelt down. He saw that her foot had triggered an old mining defense system, one of the old plasma wire traps. The beam would have sliced her leg off if it hadn't jammed. He used a tool to cut the wires and slowly pulled her free. She grunted and tried to stand, but her leg gave out. Dan caught her. "Easy," he said. "You're lucky. That trap was meant to kill anything heavier than a dog." She looked at him again, confused, as if she didn't understand why a human would help her. Dan pulled out a med patch and slapped it on her wound. "We're not enemies," he said. "At least not today." Her voice was low and rough, almost like a growl. "You saved me." "Why?" "Because I couldn't just leave you there," Dan answered simply. She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "My name is Raina." Dan nodded. "I'm Dan. Let's get you somewhere safe." As they moved toward his small landing pod, Raina leaned on him. She was heavy, strong, and proud, but something in her eyes had changed. It was no longer just pain or confusion. It was something else. End of part 1. Her eyes never left him. Dan helped Raina into the pod. It wasn't big, just a one-seater with a small cargo bay, but it had medical supplies and a heater. The planet's nights were cold. Once inside, he laid her on a stretcher and wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders. Raina's eyes followed him everywhere. Even while resting, she didn't stop watching him. Not with suspicion anymore. There was something else, something warmer, more curious. He handed her a water pack. "Here, drink this. You lost a lot of blood." She drank in slow gulps. Her sharp teeth showed briefly, but she never looked threatening. When she finished, she spoke. "I was tracking a bounty. I didn't see the trap." Dan raised an eyebrow. "A bounty?" Raina nodded. "A criminal from my people. Dangerous. He ran into this ruin. I followed." Dan sat back on the edge of a crate. "Guess the place almost claimed both of you." She tilted her head. "You are not a soldier, not a hunter. What are you?" "I scavenge," he said. "Collect old tech, sell what still works, try to avoid trouble." Raina blinked slowly. "But you ran toward danger to save me." Dan shrugged. "Didn't think. Just saw someone in pain. Couldn't walk away." Raina fell quiet again. Then she did something strange. She reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers were large and calloused, but gentle. "In my tribe, saving a warrior's life earns more than thanks." Dan looked at her, puzzled. "Like what? A reward?" Reyna's golden eyes narrowed slightly, her voice low. A bond. Dan sat still. He didn't know what to say. Reyna looked serious, like she was telling him something sacred. He wasn't sure if it was culture, instinct, or just how she was raised, but the weight of her words pressed on him. He cleared his throat. I just did what anyone decent would have done. Most would have left, she said simply. He didn't deny it. That was true. This planet was listed as unstable, full of dangerous relics. No rescue teams came here. If anyone saw a Valari warrior injured, they'd have kept walking. Reyna leaned back on the stretcher and let out a soft growl, almost like a hum. I owe you more than life. I owe you myself. Dan raised a hand quickly. Look, Reyna, I don't own you. You don't owe me anything. She just stared. In my world, that is not your choice. Dan looked away, uneasy. This was getting complicated. He had saved her because it was the right thing. He didn't expect anything. And now, he wasn't sure if he'd just stepped into something much deeper than he was ready for. Outside, the wind howled against the pod. Inside, the silence between them grew thick. Then Reyna spoke again, her voice softer this time. I will not force anything, Dan, but you must understand. My heart knows what it wants. Dan looked back at her. She was still weak, still healing. But her eyes were sure, unshaken, and in that moment Dan realized he wasn't afraid, he was curious too. The wild signal by morning the storm had passed. A pale red sun rose over the sharp rocks and broken towers of the ruined outpost. Inside the pod, Dan was already awake, checking his gear. Reyna was resting better now. Her leg was wrapped tight, and the bleeding had stopped. She didn't complain, once even when the pain flared. Her body was tougher than most humans Dan had met. As Dan adjusted the scanner, it beeped. He looked at the screen. A new signal. Weak, but nearby. It wasn't his ship. It wasn't a standard Valari beacon either. Dan frowned. Another ship? Reyna stirred, her ears twitching slightly. Show me. He turned the screen toward her. She narrowed her eyes. That's him, she growled. The one I was chasing. He's still here. Dan looked out the pod window, toward the west where the signal blinked. Then we have a problem. Reyna sat up, slow but steady. He is dangerous. If he finds us first, he'll kill you. No question. Dan nodded. Then we'll move before he gets close. Reyna tried to stand. Dan rushed forward to help, but she shook her head. No, I must stand on my own. A Valari warrior does not face her enemy while leaning on another. She gritted her teeth and pushed up. Her muscles trembled, but she held firm. Dan handed her a walking rod. It wasn't much, but it helped. Dan loaded up a small pack. We'll head north. There's a ridge that'll give us a view of the whole valley. Reyna looked at him carefully. You do not have to come. I know, he said. But I'm not letting you finish this alone. She gave him a long look. Then she nodded. They stepped out into the wind. The sand was thinner now, the path firmer. They walked for hours. Reyna limped but refused to stop. Dan kept pace beside her, watching for movement. The signal grew clearer with each mile. Finally, they reached the ridge. Below it, tucked into a broken metal hull, was a small ship, sleek, dark, with claw marks burned into the hull. Reyna growled, "That's his." Dan crouched beside her. "What's the plan?" Reyna's eyes flashed. "He left me in that trap to die. I will finish this." Dan checked his pulse gun. It was old but charged. "Then I'll back you up." She looked at him again, and this time there was something more in her expression. Not just trust, but pride. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. They waited until nightfall. Shadows and claws. The stars blinked above like cold eyes. The desert was quiet now, except for the slow wind that whispered through the rocks. Down in the ruined chamber, the enemy ship sat silent, dark. Raina crouched beside Dan, her body tense. She had tied a cloth around her injured leg to keep it steady. The pain didn't show on her face. Only focus. Dan checked his scanner again. He's still inside. One life sign. Doesn't look like he knows we're here. Raina gripped the hilt of her weapon. It was a short blade, curved, with deep marks on the handle. Battle scars. His name is Trask, she said quietly. He broke our laws. He betrayed our kin. I was ordered to bring him in. He chose to leave me for dead. Dan looked down the hill. You sure you're strong enough to face him? She turned to him. I must be. I won't let you be hurt because of my unfinished task. Dan smirked. We're in this together now, remember? She didn't argue. They moved silently through the rocks, careful not to step on loose stone. The entrance to the chamber was half buried, but Raina knew the way. They slipped inside, the air stale and bitter. The hallway was dark. Dan switched on his visor light, dim red, barely enough to see by. Raina led the way. Her steps were light, even on her bad leg. Then they heard it. A heavy bootstep echoing from inside. A shadow shifted. Dan raised his pulse gun. Raina hissed, low. He's here. From the shadows came a deep voice. I should have known you'd crawl back, Raina. A figure stepped forward, tall and armored in black scrap. His fur was matted, his eyes cold. He held a long energy spear. You're injured. You won't win this fight. Raina stepped forward anyway. You left me in a trap. You broke our code. Trask growled. You were weak. You deserved to die. Dan had heard enough. Then you'll deal with both of us now. Trask's eyes flicked to Dan. A human? You brought a pet to your death, Raina snarled. He saved me. He stood beside me. That's more than you ever did. The fight was brutal. Raina slashed with skill and fury, but her wound slowed her. Dan circled, looking for a shot. Trask knocked Raina down. He raised his spear, but Dan fired again. This time, it struck true. The blast hit Trask's arm, throwing him back. Raina lunged up, blade flashing. One strike, then another. Trask fell. He didn't move again. Raina stood over him, breathing heavy. Then she turned to Dan, her eyes fierce and glowing. It's done. Dan walked to her, checking her shoulder, now bleeding. So are you. She laughed weakly. I'll heal. They stood there. Two shapes in the dark. Both changed. The vow beneath the stars. Dan and Raina left the ruins behind before sunrise. Trask's ship was locked and damaged beyond use. There was no point staying longer. Dan helped Raina climb the ridge slowly, her steps heavy now, but her spirit lighter. They returned to the small pod just as the sky began to glow orange. Raina collapsed onto the stretcher, panting from pain and exhaustion. Dan worked in silence, cleaning her wounds again, wrapping them tighter. I'm not a medic, he muttered, but I've patched up worse. Raina chuckled softly. You saved my life twice now. Dan looked up. You saved mine too. In that ruin, if you hadn't distracted him, he would have skewered me. Raina tilted her head, watching him. That's not why I did it. Dan paused. Then why? She sat up with effort, holding his gaze. Because my heart had already chosen. Dan opened his mouth, then closed it. His chest tightened. He had heard her talk about the Valari bond, but now he understood. This wasn't just tradition. It was personal. Raina reached for something around her neck. A small piece of metal shaped like a tooth, hanging from a cord. She held it out. To him. In my tribe, she said, this is given once. To the one who is part of your soul. Dan stared at the item. It was simple. Worn. Yet her hand trembled slightly as she offered it. He didn't speak. He simply took it and slid it over his head. Raina leaned back, her voice barely a whisper. Now you are bound to me. Dan swallowed hard. So what does that mean? That wherever I go, I will protect you. That you are not alone. Ever. He sat down beside her. You know. I came here to salvage tech. I didn't expect to walk away with a bond. Reyna smirked. Neither did I. Outside, the wind howled again, but inside the pod, it was quiet. Peaceful. Dan looked at her. She was still fierce, still dangerous, but he no longer saw her as just an alien warrior. She was something more now, something close, something his. Reyna closed her eyes. You will come with me, yes? When I leave this planet? Dan nodded slowly. Yeah, I will. Her world, his place. 3 days passed before the rescue signal reached a nearby Valari patrol ship. Dan's old pod had barely enough power to keep the beacon going, but it worked. When the Valari ship arrived, Dan expected trouble, maybe suspicion, even arrest. Instead, they bowed to Reyna. She stood tall again, her wounds healing fast. She wore armor given by the ship's commander, and her name was spoken with respect. She had captured a traitor. She had survived, and she had returned with a human bonded by oath. The Valari called Dan Life Chosen. He didn't fully understand it at first, but Reyna explained later. It means you are mine and I am yours, not in chains, in heart, in strength. You saved me. I claimed you. Now they honor that. Dan had never thought of himself as someone special. He was just a scavenger, a man trying to survive. But when he stepped off the human-made dirt of that ruined planet and onto the polished floors of a Valari ship, something changed. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was part of her story. The crew watched him with careful eyes. Some were curious. Some didn't hide their doubts. But no one challenged him, not while Reyna stood beside him. Inside her private quarters, Reyna showed him a wall covered with claw mark etchings, symbols of hunts, victories, oaths. She pointed to an empty space. That's where our bond mark will go. Dan hesitated. You really see this lasting? You and me? This life? Reyna stepped close. Her hand rested on his chest. You gave me your help when I had no strength. You looked at me without fear. You didn't run when I offered my bond. That is not weakness. That is rare. Dan looked into her eyes. I still don't know everything about your people, or you. You will learn, she said. Together, later during a meal in the warrior hall, one of the younger Valari challenged Dan. Not with anger, but with tradition. If you are her life chosen, the warrior said, then show us your worth. Dan wasn't a fighter, but he didn't back down. He stood, nodded, and faced the challenge head-on. They gave him a practice staff. The fight was fast. He got knocked down once, then twice. But the third time, he stayed on his feet. He earned quiet respect that night. When they returned to her quarters, Reyna touched his shoulder and whispered, You've already done more than any test could prove. Dan smiled. So, what now? Reyna answered, without pause. Now we go to my homeworld. You meet my clan. And then we carve our place into the stars. The clan of fire and stone. The journey to Reyna's homeworld took 5 days through slipspace. Dan had never seen anything like it. The ship's walls glowed with blue veins of light, and the engines hummed like deep ocean waves. It felt alive, almost like the vessel itself was part of the crew. Reyna stayed close during the trip. She taught Dan words in her language, showed him how to grip a hunting blade, how to move like the Valari in close quarters. They trained every day, and every night they shared stories, hers of war and honor, his of earth and lost things. By the time they arrived, he no longer felt like a guest. Reyna's world was a wild mix of forest and red mountains, covered in massive trees with silver bark and rivers that glowed at night. Her clan lived high above the valley in great stone towers carved by hand. As they landed, a group of warriors waited below. Their armor shone under the twin suns. They stood tall, proud, but none stepped forward. Then, a voice thundered from the crowd. Reyna returns with her chosen. A cheer broke out, but it wasn't loud. It was steady, powerful, like thunder rolling across the land. Dan walked beside her, feeling their eyes on him. He didn't feel fear anymore, just curiosity, maybe even pride. They entered the main hall, a huge space lined with banners and fire pits. At the far end, an elder stepped down from a carved throne. His fur was gray, his shoulders scarred. Reyna knelt. Dan followed her lead. "I bring the one who saved me," she said. "The one I chose." The elder stepped closer, eyeing Dan. "You are not Valari, but you carry her mark. You did not run." "No," Dan said simply. "I stood by. Her I always will." The elder growled low, a sound of approval. "Then rise, Dan of Earth, your place is beside her. From this day you are clan-marked." Reyna stood first, then reached for a small blade. Before Dan could ask, she gently cut a shallow line across his palm and pressed it to hers. Their blood mixed, then was sealed by a glowing cloth. The hall, filled with light cheers and stamping feet. Later, under the stars, they stood on a cliff above the valley. Fires burned below where the clan celebrated. Dan leaned on the railing, looking at the world that was now his home. Reyna stood beside, him strong and proud. "You changed my fate, Dan. I was left to die. Now I live and not alone." Dan smiled. "I came to a dead world looking for scraps, and found something I never expected." Reyna turned to him, her voice soft for the first time in days. "You are mine, Dan, and I am yours. Forever." And under the alien skies, with the wild wind around them and the stars watching above, Dan believed her. Forever didn't seem so far anymore.